Again, my name is Claire Fox, and I'm a librarian here at Yale. And today I'll be introducing you to Remembering Amnesia, Rebooting the First Computerized Novel. Amnesia is a work of interactive fiction written by Thomas M. Disch, a science fiction novelist, and published by Electronic Arts in 1986. By interactive fiction, I mean a fictional work that players would interact with specifically on a computer, which we'll talk more about later. Most of this presentation will be a virtual tour of the exhibit that's currently in the Hanke Gallery. I'm going to take you through a few of the cases that are in the exhibit and provide some background on how the idea for this exhibit emerged. We'll start with the interactive amnesia workstations, move into the main room of the gallery to speak about the cases titled The Writer's Toolbox and Alternative Versions, and conclude with a look at the gallery's alcove room at the cases titled Preservation Challenges and Emulation Efforts. But before we start the tour, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk about the design detail on the right-hand side of this slide. The text is source code from Amnesia, and the purple color comes from the Amnesia game packaging. This visual theme is incorporated into all our display cases that you'll see if you're able to visit the gallery or the exhibit in the Hanke Gallery. This is the work of our amazing designer, Sid Hirschman, so big thank you to Sid. Next slide. So on this slide, there are two images. On the left is a stack of source code that's printed on printer paper that was sent to Disch for review. This printed source code is where the code on the previous slide comes from. And the image on the right is a letter that accompanied that source code sent from Disch's publisher, Electronic Arts. The source code itself is from a near final draft of Amnesia's source code, and it was written by a software development company called Cognetics Corporation. While Thomas Disch wrote the narrative script for Amnesia and designed the world that players would inhabit, Cognetics Corporation wrote the code alongside the publisher, Electronic Arts. Together, Cognetics Corporation and Electronic Arts translated Disch's narrative into computer code that could be used by three popular types of personal computers from the time: the IBM PC, the Apple II, and the Commodore 64. This translation from written word to computer code took Amnesia from a format that existed on the page to something that could be interacted with by a player on their computer. So that was then, and here we are now in 2024, and we have a stack of this source code available to us for research. It's an archival object, it's maintained in climate-controlled storage, and it's discoverable via an online finding aid. But once someone accesses something like printed source code, what do they do with it? Or how might it inform their research? For those of you who have ideas, I invite you to put those ideas in the chat now or at any point in this presentation. For me, there are a few things that spark my interest, and the main one is that this information, which is designed to interface with the computer, is printed on paper. I have to wonder if this ever happens anymore. Due to the availability of email, file transfer services, and collaborative software platforms, as well as the volume of resource it takes to create a game today, it's at least safe to say that this is no longer standard practice. Based on the letter at the right, it seems that this source code is printed by Electronic Arts and sent to Thomas Disch so he could make any edits to the code before it was finalized. I'm not sure how this actually unfolded. There are a couple of handwritten annotations on the printed code here and there, so I guess that Disch read through all this code because he was very thorough and made his annotations, and then called up Don Daglow, the producer who's referenced in this letter, who wrote this letter, and told him his edits. Then Daglow likely relayed these edits to Kevin Bentley, a programmer at Cognetics Corporation, to figure out how to make the changes or to see whether the requested changes were even possible. It's fascinating to me that this was a time where the code for a computer game was something that you could hold in your hands and comprehend as a single document. I don't think that this is something that's possible anymore. But consider how much time this took. In the 1980s, it was not yet a common assumption that everyone owned or even had access to a personal computer. Email was barely in existence. I don't know of any collaborative platforms from the time that were in the style of Google Drive or Airtable, where today you can quickly upload or create and edit shared documents. Finding the means in the 1980s to collaborate across different levels of technical access and proficiency was an endeavor unto itself, and that's not even addressing the ingenuity that it took to create the code. So that's just one idea that relates to my work in software preservation as a librarian. I'm also very interested to know what uses other researchers like students, faculty, independent researchers, or individuals and groups who are just intrigued by the materials could find when examining source code in this format. I wonder what kind of textual analysis a literature student might be able to unpack, or what insights a digital humanities or computer science student might have into the historical programming language like this one. Much of today's presentation will be a look into what kinds of materials we access and interact with for research purposes, with a special emphasis on how we engage with digitally created materials. Throughout this presentation, I invite you to consider how materials like printed source code or a fully functional computer-based work might fit into your own research. So now we're going to take a second to change gears. Thank you all for going on that introductory digression with me, and we'll now transition into our virtual tour. And this is an image of Thomas M. Disch, who is the author of Amnesia. So again, this exhibit tells the story of Amnesia, an entirely text-based work of interactive fiction that was designed to be experienced on a popular computer. Or sorry, let me start over. This exhibit tells the story of Amnesia, an entirely text-based work of interactive fiction published in 1986. In contrast to a linear narrative, interactive fiction was designed to be experienced on a personal computer, where the player allows the narrative to unfold by interacting with a series of prompts. In this work, you, the player, are the protagonist. You wake up alone in a hotel room and you have no idea who you are or where you are, and you're prompted to do something. Through interacting with the space, you eventually learn that you're in the Sunderland Hotel in New York City, and you explore various pathways you can take to observe your world and learn more about your identity as well as the trouble you're in. When the game was published in the late 1980s, interactive fiction was no longer new, and in fact was being replaced by games with graphics. However, what made Amnesia unique for its time was that the script was written by a published author and poet, so it elevated this game from a typical action-oriented video game to a work of literary art. So this image is a view of the Hanke Gallery space where you can see the main room and the alcove room of the gallery toward the back, along with some of the wall and table cases. So this exhibit aims to tell a story about the evolution of the Amnesia narrative, from handwritten notes to source code to interactive game. The materials in the exhibit are almost entirely selected from the Thomas M. Disch papers, which are part of the Yale Collection of American Literature at Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. What this means is that the exhibit was created using materials that Disch thought it was important to save and deposit at Beinecke. This exhibit also tells a story about digital preservation at Yale, providing a look into strategies that Yale staff members use to identify, stabilize, preserve, and provide access to these materials in a way that enables ongoing sustainable research support. Considering the question of access, I'll begin our tour by speaking about the interactive workstations in the library, an example of which you can see in the image on this slide. The workstations are located in Sterling Library in downtown New Haven, and there are 2 monitors next to the gallery in an area called the Nave, and 1 monitor downstairs in the adjacent Bass Library. They are computer monitors with purple screens, as you can see in this image, and there are banners that say you're invited to play either above or beside each workstation. The workstations are the intersection of the 2 narratives I just described. One is the creation of the game and the work to preserve and provide access to the game. If you were to visit the library, you'd likely notice that these workstations don't look very different from any other workstation in the library, which might raise the question of whether this is faithful access to Amnesia, which was designed for personal computers that were popular in the late 1980s, including computers like the Commodore 64. Everything you see here is an intentional choice. This is the style of access that you could expect to experience if you were a researcher requesting access to Amnesia. You would have access to a contemporary computer, but you would be interacting with a representation of Amnesia running in its original computing context using something called an emulator. Emulators are software applications that mimic computer hardware and allow users to interact with digitally created materials that would otherwise be inaccessible. What this means in this exhibit is that we are using an emulator that mimics the Commodore 64 computer, a computer that was popular in the late 1980s but is now obsolete. The emulator receives instructions from the Commodore 64 and translates them for our contemporary computers so we can interact with digitally created materials in a manner that is very similar to their original context. But I do want to highlight that emulation is an act of translation. Interacting with Amnesia using an emulator is not the same experience that players in the late 1980s had when they interacted with Amnesia on their personal computers. There are some elements of loss that occur in this translation. However, what we gain by using emulators is the opportunity to provide broader access to this game using the contemporary hardware and software of today and in the future, which are always evolving, even when the archival materials stay fixed in time. So back on our tour, we're going to enter the main room of the Hanke Gallery. There are two primary wall cases in this room, and the first one I'll speak to is called the Writer's Toolbox. So this exhibit began for me with a researcher request. Our digital preservation unit received a request to play Amnesia, and we were able to partially fulfill this request. So for context, Amnesia was distributed on two 5¼ inch floppy disks, which were a ubiquitous storage and distribution medium throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and which were playable on computers like the Commodore 64, which is the image on the right side of the slide. And you can see the Amnesia disks in the image on the left side of the slide. Amnesia was distributed on two disks instead of one, in part because it included so much information that it couldn't just be stored on one disk. It featured a vocabulary of over 1,700 words. I keep saying 17,000, but it's 1,700, and had a number of detailed environments that you could traverse throughout the game, some of which you can see on a table case in this gallery room titled Mapping the Game. When my colleague Ethan Gates and I were playing through Amnesia to prepare it for access, we were surprised when the game prompted us to flip to side 2. If we had been using hardware, we could eject the floppy disk, flip it over, and reinsert it into the disk drive. But since we were using an emulator to interact with the content on the disk, there were no sides to flip, and we didn't know how to flip to side 2 in a virtual space. Alongside other research we conducted, I decided to make a research request myself. I requested materials from the Thomas M. Disch papers using Archives at Yale, a public-facing access platform that allows patrons to search for and request archival materials. And then I went to the Beinecke reading room to see if I could find any clues about flipping to side 2. This particular research visit didn't yield the technical clues I was looking for, but instead I encountered the items that are now featured in this exhibit, which opened up my understanding of the game and of era-specific software in unexpected ways. Some of the items that first stood out to me were handwritten notes on pages with the title Amnesia, and typed drafts of the Amnesia narrative with handwritten annotations, examples of which you can see on this slide. As I read through them, I realized that Disch had written the early Amnesia drafts by hand and on a typewriter, and not on a computer. Then I started seeing notes throughout Disch's notebook that indicated he was learning how to use a computer, seemingly for the first time, and receipts indicating that he had purchased what could have been his first personal computer that he had purchased his first personal computer years after he had drafted the Amnesia narrative. This meant that even though Amnesia was written to be experienced on a computer, the person who wrote it likely didn't own a computer himself. This speaks to an era of computing history when personal computers were on the rise, but were not yet in every American home. Disch was clearly intrigued by the medium when he began work on Amnesia in 1982, but he didn't own a computer until after the narrative had been drafted. By the time of Amnesia's publication in 1986, he was using a personal computer for work and for personal use, including a slate of new interactive fiction ideas. So the next case I'll speak to is called Alternative Versions, which is the second wall case in the main room of the gallery. This case holds materials that we might typically associate with historic video games, including brightly colored packaging, custom ephemera, and of course the floppy disks. Most of the materials in this case are related to the version of Amnesia published by Electronic Arts, which you can see on this slide, but it also includes another item that stood out to me when I visited the Beinecke reading room, which was a completely different set of game packaging. Through reading other materials in the archives and pursuing some additional research, I learned that Amnesia was initially slated to be published by a book publisher called Harper & Row, which today is HarperCollins. In the mid-1980s, Harper & Row was in the process of founding a new software and technical publishing division for which Amnesia was going to be the banner product. You can see examples of the Harper & Row publication on this slide. This division was closed before it launched due to a feeling that the home software market would take at least a decade to develop, far too long for them to wait. Amnesia was then in limbo until a producer from Electronic Arts advocated to pick it up and continue its development, and they saw it through to the finish line. From what I can tell, the game sold moderately well and received somewhat lukewarm reviews, some of which you can see in another table case in this room titled Players' Reviews. What's more interesting to me, though, is seeing how these two different publishers approach publicity for the game, which you can see in a table case, again in this room, titled Marketing Challenges. In this slide, you can see examples of materials from each publisher, which honestly are some of my favorite items in the exhibit. On the left is a brochure from Harper & Row, where you can see Amnesia among its release peers, which are a screensaver called Fishies, a software guide to making the most of your Macintosh, an educational software item called QuizWiz. On the right is a letterpressed invitation from Electronic Arts that went to members of the press, inviting them to a reception for Electronic Arts artists. The difference in approach here is pretty striking, but to put it simply, where one publisher saw a technical product, another saw a new artistic medium. So I'm going to shift now to the wall cases that are in the alcove, which is a smaller room off the main gallery. These cases address the work that we do in the digital preservation unit and the software preservation and emulation unit at Yale Library. I'll start with the case that you would see when you first enter the space called Preservation Challenges. And the centerpiece of this case is Disch's K-Pro 2 computer, which was likely the first computer that he owned. And the image on this slide is Disch's K-Pro 2. This computer has been referred to as incredibly hip and portable for its time, weighing 29 pounds and featuring 64 kilobytes of memory. 40 years have passed since Disch purchased this computer, and as we're all aware, technology evolves quickly. Today, most of our mobile phones that we carry in our pockets hold the memory capacity of more than 130,000 K-Pro 2 computers. I bring this up to highlight how responsive and adaptive digital preservation librarians and archivists need to be in order to preserve collection materials that were created using computers, whether they're in works of interactive fiction or manuscripts written in word processing software or data dependent on bespoke research software. Once popular technology like floppy disks can quickly become obsolete, and depending on their storage conditions, they are also vulnerable to degradation concerns. Obsolescence and degradation concerns also impact today's popular technology, including internal and external hard drives and cloud-based sharing and storage services. It seems like every time we identify a potential problem that we'll work on in the future, that problem has a way of quickly becoming a problem for today. And as I said before, Yale staff members apply their expertise to identify, stabilize, preserve, and provide access to these materials in a way that enables ongoing, sustainable research support. This case highlights some of the strategies and tooling that we use in our work, including software that examines the condition of data present on floppy disks and software that allows us to assess corrupted data. And back in the main room in a table case called A New Way to Tell Stories, you can also see a device called the CryoFlux that we use to work directly with floppy disks. The last case I'll speak to is the second wall case in the alcove, which is titled Emulation Efforts. I spoke earlier about the fact that we use emulation to provide access to digitally created materials. And in the case of Amnesia, we're using an emulator that is specifically built to mimic the Commodore 64 computer. There are also emulators that mimic other obsolete computers, some of which have robust user communities, and others that are at different points within their own digital life cycle. Knowing which emulator you need to use to access digital content and then knowing how to use it requires deep expertise. Luckily, Yale is home to the Emulation-as-a-Service Infrastructure program of work, which is known by its acronym EaaSI, or as we call it, EaaSI. On this slide, you can see a couple of examples of the EaaSI user interface, including the landing page for the platform and an example of what Amnesia looks like when it's accessed via the EaaSI web application. EaaSI centralizes many different emulators into one platform, and the platform aims to make use of emulators easier for library patrons, as well as for library staff who support the preservation and access of digital collections. We're using EaaSI in the interactive workstations in the Nave and Bass Library, and we've also used EaaSI to provide access to other digitally created collections held at Yale. Librarians and archivists at other libraries also use EaaSI, and this emerging user community is building shared expertise that we can leverage to provide broad access to collection items like Amnesia and otherwise. I'll close by highlighting two items in this case that I think illustrate this idea of building shared expertise about software. There are two letters in this case, which you can see in this slide. I know it's a lot of text, between Thomas Disch and another science fiction writer named David Gerrold. Disch wanted to purchase screenwriting software that would appropriately format his scripts, and he reached out to Gerrold to ask him whether he had any favorites. Gerrold recommended a software program called Feature Format, which had been developed by another screenwriter, and he provided Disch with a list of recommended keyboard shortcuts and other insights into using the software. Disch wrote back to Gerrold with his own feedback for the software once he'd purchased and used it himself. For me, this exchange highlights that while technology is a technical endeavor, it's also a social one. It's very difficult to do this work alone. Whether you're developing a new work of interactive fiction or developing software to navigate the roadblocks associated with providing access to digital collections, technical work is much more rewarding when it's attempted with strong collaborators. I hope you'll all join me in making more research requests for digitally created materials so we can continue to work together on these challenges.